We start this lesson off by looking at our core objectives for this lesson. Firstly, we understand what the client brief is and where it sits on our design timeline. We develop the skill in assessing what information goes onto your brief, as well as skill in extracting this information for your brief. We learn how to set up your own briefing template and develop an understanding of the possible scenarios that you as an interior designer may be exposed to. First things first, did you know that it is an important point to research your client before having your first meeting with them? Your client relationship can make or break the business or your project. It is important to impress from day one. So what is the best way to impress your client? Ensure that you know everything you can about them and about the project. This is exactly what we are going to look at in this lesson. As we take our very first steps to any design project, we are faced with our client meeting and our client or project brief. This is your very first encounter with your client and often a very important part in your project. This is your first impression. You know that saying, first impressions count? Well, it applies here. This is where your client will get their first taste into who you are as an interior designer. It is here that the client will assess if you are going to add value to their project and if you will be able to realize their vision or their objectives. We start our project by taking our first steps into meeting our client, as well as taking the first steps into creating our project or client brief. Can any of you tell me where in the design project timeline your project brief and meeting would take place? So remember, we've got phases 1 to 5. In which phase do we take our project brief? It takes place in your first phase, obtaining the brief, step 1, because without our brief and without our clients, we wouldn't know where to begin our projects. There is a timeline we follow, so we are going to start by looking at the process flow and how your first client meeting comes about, as well as where in the process you would set up your project or client brief. The design brief process generally starts off as the client makes contact with the design firm or the designer. The client may have been referred to you by someone that they know, or they may have seen work that you've completed. Your next step as a designer is to set up your meeting with your client to discuss and review the project detail. You would then research the client and prepare for your meeting. The next step would be to meet the client, and from here, from your client meeting, we would gather all the information we need in order to create our client briefing or project briefing document. And lastly, we would need to send our client our briefing document for it to be signed off. Now you've seen the process flow, let's break it up in a little bit more detail. There are many ways in which a client would make contact with you, or ways for the designer to make contact with the client. It's also important for you as a designer to bring clients in or find the client. Getting that client first is a very important thing and not always an easy task, even for the most experienced of designers. There may be instances that a client picks you because they like your work, which is amazing, but that seldom happens. So, how do you get your first client? Let's take a look. Here are some of the ways in which you can find or attain clients. Firstly, it could be through word of mouth. Secondly, we look at paid advertising. Public relations follows, as well as networking through suppliers and subcontractors. And last but not least, we can find our clients through social media. We've now covered some of the ways in which you can find clients. Let's break it up a little bit. Firstly, we looked at word of mouth. Word of mouth is the most important and most effective way for an interior designer to bring in or acquire new clients. This is effectively someone who has seen your work recommending you to a new potential client. This could be from a supplier or a subcontractor recommending your work, right through to a previous client's recommendation or estate agent that may be using your work to sell their business. The next on our list is our paid advertising. Paid advertising simply means to pay for advertising for your interior design company or work. I would suggest that this is used in larger companies with a bigger footprint in interior design world, as it can be a costly exercise. Customers may see your advert in magazines or on social media or other paid platforms. The next on our list is public relations. This can be a great way to market yourself and your company as a freelance designer or as a business. Writers, editors, and journalists have space to fill, even more so online. Look for any interior design pages or advertisements that may come about. The next way to find clients is through networking, exchanging your information with suppliers, contractors, estate agents, or even other interior designers or architects. Networking is about sharing information, passing each other's information along to new potential clients. The crucial thing with supplier recommendations is that you can often get background detail on the new prospective clients before even meeting with them. Quite an important tip here, and one to remember when networking with suppliers. Next and last on our list is social media. Social media is fairly effective, but more so, it is great for getting in touch with your peers and the people that you want to contact and collaborate with. Social media platforms that can be used could be Facebook, Instagram, and even Pinterest. If you want a little bit more information here, have a look at our sales, digital marketing, social media marketing, or how to start a business course to get more detail on the marketing perspective. Now that we've got our clients through our media marketing and referral attempts, it is time to set up our meeting with our new client. So, how do we go about doing that? Let's take a closer look. First off, we start by setting up our meeting, which simply means setting a time and a date that you can meet with the client. Ideally, you want to set up your meeting on site of the proposed project. You want to allow enough time to be able to discuss the project objectives with the client and obtain as much information about the project in reality as possible. Allow enough time so that you do not feel pressured or rushed. Remember that this is your time to create your first impression with potentially your brand new client. So once we've set up our meeting, it is vital that we conduct a bit of research on the project and the client that we may be working with. This is the research section of our timeline. Preparation is one of the biggest keys to effective and efficient meetings. Entering a meeting without knowing your client's background or network or industry viewpoints puts you at a disadvantage very early on in the project. Before meeting with your client, ensure that you know exactly where the project is situated, as well as any detail connected to the project. Treat this as an interview. Make sure that you have at least some baseline information or knowledge about your client and his or her business, as well as the project in question. If you're working with a retail client or commercial client, ensure that you have an understanding of your client's stance in the industry and any success and struggles that the company has faced. See if you're able to assess if the client has any preferences in design. You can do this by seeing what the current space looks like and what they have worked with or created before. Next on our process timeline is to meet the client. Quite an important step in our timeline, but definitely one that we needed to prepare for before. It's D-Day. We are finally meeting with our client. Being prepared is your number one priority here. You have researched everything that you can and you're ready to get into the detail. But before that, there are a couple of things to consider when going into your client meeting. Let's take a look at some of these things that one needs to consider before and during the meeting. Firstly, it is vital that we are prepared. Generally, a great idea to set a meeting agenda. It is important to ask the relevant questions during your meeting, as well as listen to your client's viewpoints and comments. And last but not least, at the end of your meeting, it is important to wrap up and follow up the meeting. So let's break these points up. First things first, we need to be prepared. Make sure that you have all of your drawings, information that is vital to your project to be able to bring along with to your meeting. It is your responsibility to anticipate what the client will need or expect to have with them in this meeting. Bring extra copies of materials or items that your client may forget, which will help ensure efficiency of the meeting. In cases with my projects, I always bring any drawings that I can get my hands on, plus extra copies for the client. And I always have a tape measure, pen and pencil, and my sketchbook in every single meeting. Our second point on our checklist is creating an agenda for your meeting. In the game of interior design, your time is everything. It's a great idea to take the time to create an agenda and define the objectives for why you are having this meeting. This will act as your project meeting guideline to keep your meeting on track and to ensure no points are left out. Your agenda will outline your plan for the meeting, as it's an outline of how you plan to check each item off and accomplish the headings and goals. The meeting agenda, in essence, is a simple document that groups together all the vital information that needs to be covered in this meeting. This agenda can be created for your first meeting and then used right the way through your project. Here's an example of an agenda that I've created that you can use in your meetings. Some of the key points or core topics that I've included on this agenda are as follows. Firstly, you need to give your project a name and title. We then need to include any dates and times of said project and dates and times of the meeting. Give your objectives a heading, so include any important information or topics that you need to cover in this meeting. Our next point is dates of completion. You can include dates of completion if needed, otherwise just dates of tasks that need to be done. Include as much detail and description that you feel is necessary. Include any areas that need to be signed off by the client or the designer. This is to ensure that no information gets left off or any wires get crossed during this process. Including a sign-off section is probably one of the most important areas or sections to your agenda. Definitely include it, and it can be included in a simple box form or just a little dotted line to indicate a signature. I have created a template that you can use and I've attached it in your summary notes. So definitely go and have a look at that and try and fill out as much as you can along the way. This next topic or point is an incredibly important one. This is the reason you are having your meetings, to be able to get all the information that you need to be able to create your project brief. You would essentially add these questions to your meeting agenda. You are asking all the questions not only to show the client that you know what you're talking about, but to instill confidence into the client. We also need to accurately assess what the client would like to do and drag or pull out the project scope or the project brief. Asking the relevant questions simply means asking as many questions as you possibly can about your project to generate your project brief. This relationship is new, and now is the best time to gather as much information as possible. Ask questions that pertain to the function of the space, what the client intends to have when the space is complete. Once again, take notes. Knowing about the client's upcoming holiday plans, family events, or even preferences between tea and coffee could be of great use in the future. Let's take a look at some of the questions or the relevant questions a designer would typically ask during these meetings. So firstly, one of the most important questions is, what is the budget? Secondly, what time period do we have to complete said work or said project? What is the style direction that the client is gravitating towards? What the project goals are? And lastly, and a very important one, are there any project restrictions? So let's break these questions down as they are imperative to assisting us in creating our project briefs. We start off with the most important question and the most important piece of information that you'll have to outline your project. What is the budget? It's an incredibly tough question to ask right off the get-go, especially considering that this is the first time you may be meeting your client. But it can be such a waste of time if you're not clear on the client's budget and if their budget is not consistent with the services and products that you are proposing or offering. If you're not getting a solid figure or number right off the bat, you can ask a question like, what price range would you suggest that we stick in? Or what price range are you comfortable with? For example, are we looking at 10 to 100,000, or are we looking from 500,000 to $1 million? You need to at least determine that they are in a realistic budget range or price range that would allow you to give them what they are looking for. This figure is also going to give you an idea of what type of materials you're able to use and where you can source the materials or products for your project. The next point is, what is our time frame? This is our second most important question in our meeting with our clients. What is the client's expected timeline or time frame in which we are able to complete our project? Even though the client may not have a realistic timeline or deadline, we can try to make sure that we come as close as we can to what they are expecting that timeline or time frame to take us. We are also able to advise the client right from the get-go to ensure that we have a happy client. Happy clients equal happy designers. For example, our client may say that they're wanting to renovate their new bathroom before the family moves in December. But we are taking our client brief in November, and you know that the builders go on leave in 2 weeks. This is not a realistic timeline. However, you are able to make the client aware of this right from the beginning of the project, and you can alter the schedule accordingly. Again, happy client equals happy designer. Our next question, we start off by asking our client, what are they wanting to achieve? What is the design vision or goal? The answer to this question will give us a clear idea of the direction to follow and the flow of the project. You can also ask them to show you any images that they like or any images that they prefer or dislike. For example, if your client wants an ultra-modern space, you know immediately that a neutral color scheme and a bold masculine line are your starting points for your project. A handy tip, you could suggest to your client to create a Pinterest board where they can gather all the images that they like to assist you in putting together the final look and feel for your project. So this is essentially like a mood board or a sample board collection. The next question on our list is that we need to understand the goals and objectives of the project to ensure that we produce a project that ticks off all the client's boxes. Before you discuss how to design a client space, make sure you know what they want help with. Some good details to pin down in the beginning stages of your project are the function of the space. What is the use of the space? What will happen in the space? Secondly, how the client intends to use the space. So what is their final intention for the space? So for example, it might be a lounge now, and in 2 months' time, once we've completed our design, the space might be used for a baby's room. Next, we need to understand what will stay and what will go. What features need to be removed from the space. Next, we look at whether any additions need to be built in or installed, followed by how much work will need to be completed within that space and any specific requirements such as accessories, furniture, lighting, and placement. And lastly, and most importantly, the client's likes and dislikes. This is only going to help us with our planning and our project. The last question, and one that I always spend quite a bit of time on, are there any restrictions? Are there any restrictions that we need to know about before we start our project? Here, it's also important to ascertain any complications that you may see or foresee encountering during the project and the project lifespan. So now we've covered the following when meeting our client. We know that we need to be prepared. We know that we need to set up our meeting agenda. We have to ask the relevant questions while in our meeting. The next important factor when meeting our clients is to listen to your client and follow up and wrap up at the end of our meeting. Let's look at that in more detail. Listening to your client is very important. Not every meeting will go exactly according to plan. Sometimes a client might have their own agenda in mind or want to take the project to a totally different direction. And our last point when meeting with your client is wrap up your meeting. People often underestimate the importance of effectively closing a meeting. Instead of leaving after all the points of your agenda have been discussed, have a wrap-up plan in place. Summarize, summarize, summarize. Ensure that you're all on the same page before closing off your meeting. Here is probably a good point to have an indication or a place mark for a signature, just to indicate that the meeting has been finalized and all the points have been covered. We have now covered how to find your first client, how to set up your first meeting, how to conduct research on your first project, and how to prepare for your first client meeting. Our next step is to set up our client brief for your project. Set up our project briefing document. That brings us to our next topic. What is the client brief? But before we get any further into our client brief, let's see what we have installed for our lesson 3, the architect. Remember, we spoke about how important it is to work with architects and how interiors need to work in harmony with the exteriors. Well, this is where we explore all of that and where we look at prominent architects in the industry. But this is only a sneak peek for today. Let's get back into our design brief. A design brief is a document drawn up by the interior designer, which outlines the deliverables and scope of works that the project will follow, based on the information obtained from the client meeting. Your design brief may include headings that you've obtained in your client meetings, such as the roles and responsibilities, the project timeline or time frame that it needs to follow, an indication of the budget, and the function of the space and the client's goals. A thorough design brief is a critical part of the design process. It helps to develop the trust between the client and the designer. Often clients aren't aware that the interior designer is there to help them realize their objectives, and your design brief is indicative of this. Let's take a look at some of the key information that your design brief needs to outline. Firstly, it needs to include key tasks and functions within the space, the key requirements and constraints of the project, identification of the procurement methods, and procedures that will need to be followed. Why is it important to obtain or create your design brief? Firstly, it allows both client and designer to know and understand the expectations of the project, from a simple operational requirement to the aspirations and visions of the client. To put it simply, it allows everyone to get on the same bus and head down the same project road. In every design brief, there are a few headings that are vital to the successful development of your project. Let's take a closer look at your design brief. In your brief, you need to include the following headings to form a detailed brief. Firstly, we need to include the client's objectives. The client needs to determine and outline their objectives to the designer to communicate the desired outcome and the desired result. We need to include the target market. There needs to be an understanding of the audience that is going to use, engage, and occupy this space. We need to include the project scope. This is a rough outline of the scope that the project will take on. Here you will use all the information that you've gathered in your client meeting to express the needs and what you want to achieve. Next, we have to include the timeline. Keep this realistic. How much time do we have to allocate to each function and element of this project? And lastly, but most importantly, the budget. As you develop the list of requirements for the project, you will have a rough idea about costs that you expect to incur during the lifespan of the project. These estimates will make it easier to have a final budget estimate for your client. If you would like some more information on the detail for your project brief, I've added this to your bonus content, as well as a template for your design brief that you can use on all of your projects going forward. So be sure to give that a little look and check it out and see if you can add all of this detail into your design brief. Now that we've covered a typical project brief, let's take a look at an example. Sophia, our client, needs a new office renovation. She has been referred to us through a colleague that has recently used us to renovate their offices. Here is what we need to include on our design brief. Firstly, we need to include the project title. So in this instance, my project title is Sophia's Office Renovation. I've also added the address of the client as well as the address of the project. Secondly, I've added the date and the reference for the project. So 2020.08.24, the date that the brief was sent to the client. Thirdly, I've got headings indicating what my client's objectives are. The objectives of my client in this instance would be to renovate her new space in a modern style. I would also list some of the contractors that we may need to bring on board, which would include my HVAC or aircon contractor, an engineering team, maybe electrical contractors, and definitely a construction team. The next point on our project brief is our target market, but in this instance, a target market wouldn't apply as it typically applies to retail and commercial projects. And as we know, this is a commercial office project, but doesn't need any target market referencing. Next heading on our project brief is our project scope. It is the designer's responsibility to develop a concept and as-built drawings for the contractors. This is something that you would indicate on your project brief. In this instance, let's look at an example of the scope that may take place. So we would definitely have demolition of existing space. I would indicate additional new drywalls. We would put an indication in for doors, new flooring, lighting, and electrical points where applicable. I would also include that all joinery and specifications would be detailed up in drawings drawn by the designer. The next point on our project brief is our timeline. So if we are using our example to create our timeline, in Sophia's instance, she needs us to complete this project in a month. I know that drawings will take approximately 2 weeks and the installation of the project approximately 3 weeks. So obviously this is going to take 5 weeks, which is a little bit above her expectation. We need to ensure that this is documented and have the client sign this off. And the last point on our project brief is our budget. We indicate our design fee and the estimate of the project expenses here. If we are a senior designer or the owner of the company, we would be expected to indicate what we expect the project to cost in a per square meter rate or a rough idea of the overall cost. But again, this would only be for a senior designer or someone that has a lot of experience with cost and budget estimation. Once you've created your project or client brief, the last step in the process is to send this off for your client to sign off, accept, and approve your project proposal. Once your brief has been approved and signed off, you have successfully completed one of the hardest parts of your project. Well done. Now for the creativity to flow. We can start planning our project. That brings us to the end of our lesson. Let's take a recap of what we've covered today. Firstly, we had a look at how to find our clients. We then looked at setting up our first meeting and creating our first meeting agenda. We looked at setting up our project brief and all the information pertaining to this brief. As you can see, the design brief makes it much easier to narrow down the focus on what we are wanting to achieve in our project. It also groups all of our information into one solid format for the client and the designer to follow or tap into through the lifespan of the project. With all that being covered, we get to the challenge for today's lesson. The challenge is to create your own project brief. Here's the scenario. Your client Sophia has contacted you via a referral as she's seen an office that you had designed for a friend. We have already met with Sophia on site at her current office space. Here is your brief. Her current space is 50 square meters. She wants to include another 2 office spaces within this current space. So it's currently a blank space and she needs to incorporate 2 new offices for 2 people. Each office needs to have a desk and a chair, as well as a public printing station and coffee bar. She would like us to include new carpets and remove existing. We need to look at new wall finishes, so some paint or wallpaper. A bit of extra detail. The current flooring is carpet and needs to be replaced with tile. The electrical and lighting can remain as is. The walls are looking a little bit shabby and she's asked if we can provide her with some suggestions for this, so that ties into our wall finishes. She's given us the budget of between 100,000 Rand or $8,000, but you obviously can use your own currency. You need to include or indicate the following on your design brief: what the client objectives are, the target market, the project scope, the timeline, and your budget. In addition to that, the client wants you to create a sample board and space plan based on the new design to present at the next meeting. Remember, guys, we are only creating the project brief, but this information is vital to adding to our project brief.